Hi, seventh graders. Welcome back. Today we are going to be continuing on our ratio and proportions unit. In the past couple of days, we've been reviewing what you learned last year with rates and ratios and proportions, and now we're going to start jumping in to new content that we are going to use and build from the content and the skills that we learned last year with the new material that we're learning this year. So today we're going to be talking about proportions with complex fractions. So our objective for today is I will be able to solve proportions with complex fractions. I'll be able to solve proportions with complex fractions. So a complex fraction is a fraction that has a fraction in the numerator and or in the denominator. So it's a fraction that has another fraction in the numerator and or in the denominator. That means it can be, a fraction with a fraction in just the numerator, a fraction with a fraction in just the denominator, or both. So let's look at an example. Sam walked 3/4 of a mile in 2/5 of an hour. 3/4 of a mile in 2/5 of an hour. Okay, so when we write that, we write 3/4 over 2/5. You see that there is a fraction within a fraction within a fraction. Okay, so 3/4 is a fraction, 2/5 is a fraction, and we put it together because it's a rate, it's its own fraction. So it's a complex fraction. There's multiple fractions within a fraction. So 3/4 over 2/5. So when we're writing this, make sure that we're writing it in a way that is easy to see and understand. Let me show you what I mean that can be a little bit tricky. All right, so some of you, when you're writing this, you're going to write 3 over 4, and then this little fraction bar, and then 2 over 5. All right, I didn't do too bad writing this, but you see how sometimes, if we don't make this fraction bar long enough, it kind of doesn't look like there are two fractions on top of each other. So be careful on how you're writing it and that it's neat and doesn't look so sloppy. All right, so let's look at a unit rate problem involving that complex fraction. So Mariah can run 2.5 miles in 1/4 hour. If she continues running at this rate, how many miles can she run in 1 1/5 an hour? And that should say hours, so let me add that. 1 1/5 hour. 1 1/5 hour. 1 1/5 hour. If she continues running at this rate, how many miles can she run in 1 1/5 hour? So we have 3 steps, and I want you to write down all of this, so you will need to pause this. So step 1 is to set up the proportion. Step 2 is to cross multiply the parts of the proportion that you know. And step 3 is divide by the remaining known quantity. So let's look at this step by step. Let's break it down. So here's our problem again. It's the same problem that we just looked at. Mariah can run 2.5 miles in 1/4 hour. If she continues running at this rate, how many miles can she run in 1 1/5 hour? So let's set up that proportion. Let's set up that proportion. So we can run 2.5 miles, 2.5 miles. And I'm labeling it so we can make sure that we set it up right. All right, over 1/4 hour. Okay, and that's equal to, it's proportion to, it's equal to, and we want to know 1 1/2 hour. Forgot the label there. 1 1/5 hour. So we need to make sure that our hours are in the same in the denominator. They're both in the same. They're both in the bottom. So 1/4 hour, and we want to know how many miles in 1 1/5 hour. So 1 1/5 hours, but we're not sure how many miles that is. There's our proportion. 2.5 miles over 1/4 hour is equal to how many miles in 1 1/5 hour? So there's our proportion. That's step 1. Okay, there's our proportion, step 1. Step 2 is cross multiply the parts of the proportion that you know. So let me rewrite this proportion. We have 2.5 mile over 1/4 hour is equal to 1 1/5 hour is how many miles? Okay, so we're going to cross multiply. So cross multiply, you see over the equal sign. This only works if it's over the equal sign. Okay, so we're cross multiplying, and we're only going to cross multiply the parts that we know. So you see how we know 2 1/2 mile and 1 1/5 hour. So we're going to multiply 2 1/2 mile times 1 1/5 mile hour. So 2 1/2 times 1 1/5. Now we've been working on this for the whole year, so this is easy peasy. So to multiply fractions, we need to go make them into improper fractions. So 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5. So 5 halves times, and then same thing here. 5 is still going to be our denominator. 1 times 5 is 5, plus 1 is 6. All right, so now we just go right across. 5 times 6 is 30. And 2 times 5 is 10. So 30 over 10. Okay, and then it's going to say, step 3, divide by the remaining known quantity. So we have 30 over 10, and we need to divide. Now the one that we haven't done is 1/4 hour. That's what we haven't done yet, is 1/4 hour. So that's what we're going to divide. So step 3, and I'm just going to keep it right here so we don't lose the work that we've done so far. So step 1 is right here. Step 1, we set up a proportion. Step 2, we cross multiply the proportions that we know. Step 3, divide by the remaining known quantity. So we have 30 over 10 divided by, and then we said that the 1/4 is the remaining quantity, divided by 1/4. Okay, so remember when we're dividing fractions that we change flip. So when we keep 30 over 10, we multiply by 4 over 1. Okay, so then when we do that, we have 30 times 4. Well, we know that 3 times 4 is 12. Add that 0. And then 10 times 1 is 10. And then when we simplify this, those zeros can cancel out, and that leaves us with 12. So, how many miles can she run in 1 1/2 hour, 1 1/5 hours? She can run 12 miles. And I want you to make sure you write that label down. Okay? Now, one way thing that we could have done to make it just one step easier is this 30 over 10, we could have reduced it right here and have just had 3 over 1 and then multiplied it, would have given us the same answer. If you would have seen that, it would have done the same thing. Alright, so I want you to pause the video and try this on your own. Jeremy drove 12 1/2 miles in 1/4 hour. How many miles can he drive in 2/3 of an hour? Alright, so I hope that you paused the video. So step 1, check your work with me as you're doing it. Okay, and let's make sure that I have my pen tool. Oopsie, don't want to do that. Play from current slide. Alright, so there we go, there's our pen. So we're setting up a proportion. So we drove up 12 1/2 miles in 1/4 hour. All right, how many miles can he drive in 2/3 of an hour? So we want to know how many miles. So there's our proportion, that's step 1. Step 2 is to cross multiply the parts that we know. So we have 12 1/2 miles times 2/3 hours. So 12 1/2 times 2/3. And I wrote pretty big, so I might have to move this picture a little bit. So 12 1/2 times 2/3. So 12 times 2 is 24, plus 1 is 25. So that's supposed to be 2. There we go. 25 over 2 times 2 over 3. 25 times 2, think of those quarters. We have 50 over 6. 2 times 3 is 6. Step 3, divide by the remaining known quantity. So step 3, we have 50 over 6 divided by, and then our remaining quantity, the one that we know, is 1/4. Because it has that match, that pair that we don't know, that's what we're dividing by. So 50 over 6 divided by 1/4. So when we divide by fractions, you need to keep change flip. So we have 50 over 6 times 4 over 1. 50 times 4 is 200. Think of those quarters again. Over 6. 200 over 6. Alright, 200 over 6 is how many miles that he's going to drive. Now, no one talks like that. No one says 200 over 6. So we need to make that into a decimal. 200 over 6 into a decimal. Now remember, 200 over 6, that's the same thing as saying 200 divided by 6. So, you're going to go 200, and 200 is in the house, divided by 6. How many times does 6 go into 2? Well, no times. How many times does 6 go into 20? You can go in 3 times, which is 18. 20 minus 18 is 2. Bring down the 0. Okay. Then we have how many times does 6 go into 20 again? So we have 33. Bring down the 2. Add the point. Add the decimal. How many times does 6 go into 20? And look, it's going to repeat. So 33.3 repeating. And if you remember that fraction, and you can also write it as a fraction with the remainder as well. We want to know how many miles can you drive in 2/3 of an hour? Well, he can drive 33 and 1/3 mile. And there's our answer. So I hope that this is making sense. Don't worry, we're going to be going over it a lot more in class. So for now, don't forget to write down your 2 questions about this video, and I will see you tomorrow with those questions. Have a nice night.